Hey guys, welcome to Irish Medieval History. This week I will be covering the Irish versus Vikings myth. It seems to be trending all over the internet again. I've been going on to Reddit, Discord, and a few other places, and I see people having this conversation once again where the Vikings had invaded Ireland and started to take it over, which is a myth I've been trying to dispel since forever. Seán Duffy back in 2014 released this book. Or should I use this side? This is not really on that side. Anyway, back in 2014, Seán Duffy had released this book, The Battle of Clontarf. And in it, he really tackled the argument of Irish versus Viking myth. In it, he highlighted the fact that many Vikings, but by the time Clontarf happens, which is in 1014, the Vikings had lived in Ireland for about 200 years. So by then, the Vikings had pretty much become Gaelicized. They were referred to, as many historians would refer to them today, as the Hiberno Scandinavian. Back then, they were known as the Gáedel or the Ustmen. And so by then, they had really become Gaelicized. Their first language was Gaelic. They were following Irish law. They had become Gaelicized into the realm of Ireland. They weren't part of a country since it was mostly dominated by clans, and that's something I want to really highlight next week in this whole nationalism myth that Ireland was a nationalist country, that everyone was born with a tricolour. When anyone who's opened up a book on Cuchulainn or any of them would clearly know that Ireland is dominated by clans, and the clan system, as we call it today, dominated by Brehon law, etc., right? And the reason why I'm also highlighting this now is that's the mind frame people had back then. It wasn't a case of foreign people would come in and then they would get chased off the island by a bunch of clans. People would come in, you had people from the church, the clergy would come in and tell them what was happening in Rome. You would have various diplomats who would come onto the island and try to negotiate trade and various other bits and bobs, alliances, so they could fight their enemy overseas, something on that value, okay? And so it wasn't a case of a bunch of people in their underwear running around the place. They were dressed in the latest fashion in Ireland. They had a cloak with a brooch, and they would have had very tight pants. They weren't naked, okay? So it wasn't a case when people came on the island that they were being chased out of it. And the Vikings were exactly the same. When the Vikings came to Ireland, their main goal at the very start, we're talking about the Vikings themselves, was to attack a weak point that started to appear with the Golden Age of Ireland. With the Golden Age of Ireland, most of the monastic settlements in Ireland started to go onto the fringes of society, onto the seaside and the beaches and the islands just off of Ireland. And so they weren't really protected, and they became an easy target for raiders, for Vikings. And that's exactly what happened. Vikings came in, they sacked some of the major important monastic settlements in Ireland, not just in Ireland, also in Britain. We all know it was Lindisfarne, which started the Viking Age. And so that's what starts the Viking Age, okay? And is this entirely Viking versus Irish? Not quite, because on the island of Ireland, you have the clans fighting each other, as we call them today, or the various kingdoms, such as the Ullid are fighting the Inail. The Inail are also having a civil war against Northern Inail versus Southern Inail. Down in my area in Munster, we have the Kingdom of Cashel is fighting Cork. And so if we take, for example, where I live, down in Cork, the Vikings come in and they don't raid and attack the monastic settlement of St. Finbarrs. This is where it gets quite funny and quite strange for people who believe in the myth. And that is, the Vikings come in and they settle in what is today Cork. And they don't just settle anywhere, they literally settle outside the monastic settlement, and they build an alliance with the monastic settlement of St. Finbarrs, and they join together to go against the Kingdom of Cashel, which is very interesting. Later on, when we go into the later 10th century, you have Vikings who settle in Limerick, and they ally themselves with Cashel, who the Cork Vikings and St. Finbarrs were already joined together fighting against. So then you have Vikings on Viking violence, where I'm from in Munster, which is quite interesting, and it tells you a lot that this was very mixed. Now, of course, I'm not denying the fact that the Viking Age literally starts with Viking raiders coming down from Scandinavia. For Ireland in particular, that would have been Norway. For England, it would have been Danish Vikings for the most part. Now, it is very mix and match. You would have had Danish Vikings coming into Ireland. You would have had Norwegians going into England and raiding and attacking. But the same thing was happening in the mainland. Of course, you have rivalries in Ireland. If O'Neill, the Inel, are attacking each other, Northern Inel are attacking Southern Inel, they're also attacking their own monastic areas. So the Northern Inel will go into Southern Inel territory, and they'll specifically attack their monastic settlements and take their riches away from them. They may also attack those monastic settlements and replace the abbot, bishop, or whichever clergy was in charge of that monastic settlement with their own. So that way they were taking over that area and they would enforce it. Then in retaliation, that area, the clans in that area, go back in and they would either physically force that member of the clergy out or kill him, even get his head and drown him in. That seems to be quite popular. So that would happen. So they would fight in and out of who was in charge of the clergy, or they would just go in, burn, and attack. Dr. Damien Bracken actually went off and counted every single attack that was in the Ulster Annals, and he ended up finding that the Irish clans in Ireland, the Tuats, were doing more damage to monastic settlements than the Vikings were, which is quite interesting, very interesting. Then a lot of people move on to the whole topic of slavery, that the Vikings had brought slavery into Ireland and that Dublin was the biggest slave trade in Europe. And where I'm not denying that, that's a very black part of our history, and Dublin was the biggest slave trade in Europe. To say the Vikings had brought it in is actually wrong. Slavery was already a part of Irish history before the coming of the Vikings. In fact, one of our greatest patrons, the man who actually literally is the picture of Ireland, St. Patrick, was actually brought over to Ireland by slavery. So slavery was already a part of our society with the coming of the Vikings. And yes, it is true, the Vikings did bring in one of the biggest slave trades in Western Europe, which was Dublin. If you read the Icelandic sagas or if you read any of the Islam literature, they highlight how big Dublin was at the period. It was the New York of the early medieval era, and it was all funded by slavery. But the people who were making the majority of the money out of that in tribute was people like Mael Shocknall after the Battle of Tara, Brian Boru. A lot of Irish kings afterwards were making a lot of profit. Whoever was the most dominant king on the island at the time was going into Dublin, collecting their tribute and leaving again. And on top of that, you also had Gaelic clans who would also go a Viking overseas. And if you read the Finn cycle, you've got examples of Fenian jumping onto boats, going over to Scotland, etc., getting slaves. They were going into Dublin then and selling them. It was the same on clan fighting in Ireland against the two Tuats. The losing side would have their slaves would be taken, and then, well, their people would be taken, put into slavery, and then sold in Dublin most likely. So this wasn't a case of, oh, this was all the Vikings and the Vikings were doing it. Then people move on to Brian Boru, and they try to make out that it was Brian Boru that got rid of the Vikings and the Vikings were finally gone, they were finally subdued. And once again, as I was saying at the start, Seán Duffy really goes to town on this, on his book. And in this, Seán Duffy highlights the fact that the Battle of Clontarf itself wasn't Irish versus Vikings. In fact, it was really mixed, and the leading heads of the Battle of Clontarf was Brian Boru on one side, the leader of the Irish, or the men of Ireland, as it is in the literature, and on the other side, it was actually the men of Leinster, and it was actually a rebellion against the system. His allies, the kings in Dublin, was it Sitric Silkenbeard? He was actually the son-in-law of Brian Boru. They were both related because by then 200 years had gone by, and the Scandinavians, in particular Norway, had settled in Ireland and become Gaelicized. They spoke Gaelic. Their mother and father were very Gaelic by this period. Most likely their father spoke Norse and their mother spoke Gaelic, so they would have been a part of the two worlds, but their first language was still Gaelic. And on top of that, although they were still building Norse houses because they would have learned how to build houses from their fathers, most of the fortifications were built in a monastic style, and also the style of the Anglo-Saxons, because the Norse-Gaels, the hiberno Scandinavians, had spent a lot of time in England and had learned fortification defences from both the Anglo-Saxons and from the monastic areas in Ireland. So you can see the fusions of the two cultures. And also the style of warfare with the Norse-Gaels as well was very much using javelins, bows, anything that they have learned from the two cultures had very much fused together with the Norse-Gaels. Norse-Gaels would have also worn cloaks with brooches. We can see that with various finds I can highlight. And so the Norse-Gaels were very what we would call these days multicultural. You know, they were a culture of their own. And to turn around and say that Sitric Silkenbeard with the King of Leinster was mostly then Gaelic and Viking against the Gaelic side is also wrong, because Brian Boru was allied with our side, the Cork Vikings, and the Limerick Vikings, and he had Vikings from Wexford and Vikings from Waterford. So to say it was Vikings and Gaelic against Gaelic or Gaelic against Vikings is completely wrong. And it's not even he's fighting off a Viking invasion or he's subduing the Vikings. There is an Irish Viking family, the Emer, who are subdued in 980 at the Battle of Tara, but also highlighting the fact that these people were already Norse-Gaels. They were Irish Vikings. They were one of us. The typical Dubs, basically. They were the men of Dublin. That's how literally they're referred to in the literature, as the men of Dublin. They're not called Norse-Gaels or Hiberno Scandinavians. They're called the men of Dublin in the literature because that's what they are, and that's they still are today. We still refer to them as the men of Dublin today, the men and women of Dublin. Finally, a lot of people online like to highlight the fact that the Vikings are highlighted as foreigners throughout. And yeah, that's true. The Vikings are highlighted as foreigners throughout. A lot of people that come to Ireland in the medieval period are considered foreigners. Even people who are on their side. The Galloglass, the foreign mercenaries, who were made up of the MacSweeneys and various other clans that immigrated to Ireland. They would have lived in Ireland for about 400 years, and they're still referred to continuously over and over again as foreigners. The Normans who come to Ireland, when they become the Hiberno Normans later on, they're still referred to as foreigners throughout. The Fitzgeralds are referred to as the Old English continuously throughout. The Donegal and Fingal who immigrate to Ireland continuously referred to as foreigners, and that's from the Irish perspective of, you know, their family. They can literally trace their lineage all the way to the very start of Ireland with the Ireland and the invasion of Ireland, where they come in from Spain and they take over the country, and that's where they can trace their roots from all the way back to Moses. And so what this shows us is that the Irish are very much trying to prove, oh, we have better right of land than you do. Because most of this conversation and stuff, this whole you're a foreigner, although you've lived here for about 400, 500 years, it kind of stops once the feudalism comes to an end in Ireland, which is in 1603. You don't see that word being chucked around as much as it used to be with you're a foreigner. Now, it gets even more interesting when you highlight the fact that the literature that a lot of people who believe in the Irish versus Viking myth highlight, and this is the number one literature, and it's actually from the 12th century. It is the War of the Irish with the Foreigners, and in this, it's written by Murtagh y Breen, who is the grandson of Brian Boru. And in this, Murtagh y Breen is continuously highlighting the foreigners. Like if you were to read this Obviously, I would say most of the time you should read medieval manuscripts from the medieval point of view, and you should definitely do it with this, and also kind of take a step back and ask, why does he keep highlighting foreigners, them foreigners? And that's down to the fact that Murtagh Breen is trying to get in line on the good side of the Pope because he's trying to get recognised as King of Ireland. The problem is that the papacy and a lot of Europe is not happy that Dublin was the biggest slave trade in Europe. And therefore, Murtagh Breen needs to find a scapegoat. And just like today, funny enough, when they need an scapegoat, they'll turn around and say, them pesky foreigners. It was all the foreigners doing. Although today, just like in the Viking age, majority of foreigners, although there was troublemakers, just like the Vikings who went in and burned the place, there are a lot of Scandinavians that immigrated to Ireland, and they straight away started following Brehon law. They started trading. They started marrying into local people. They had no problems. As I pointed out, the Cork Vikings are a good example of this. The Cork Vikings never had any problems assimilating into society. They got on perfectly well with St. Finbarr's Church. Yes, it's true, they joined up with St. Finbarr's Church to fight Cashel, another Gaelic kingdom, but that's what people did back in the medieval period. There's never a thing of them coming in and attacking the locals in St. Finbarr's. It's nowhere in any of the literature. Yeah, you have one or two Vikings that come in and they're more scary and another thing, but they don't go and attack each other. There's never in the manuscript St. Finbarr's went and attacked the Cork Vikings, or the Cork Vikings went and attacked the men of St. Finbarr's. It's just not in the literature. And I think that should be a good giveaway exactly what was going on in Ireland at the time, that it wasn't a case of Ireland versus Norway, the Vikings or whatever, that it is exactly what it was like back in the early medieval period. It was clans, families and families moving in. Sometimes they agreed, sometimes they disagreed. But it wasn't a case of, my nationality against your nationality, because a lot of people online, they look at it from their modern perspective. And I've been doing this now for about 15 years, going online, having historical conversations. I've gone into tourism for a good bit. I've gone into university. And when I explain this to people, because I've also done living history and, I was saying before, tourism, so I would be in a situation where I would talk to people who would have no idea about the Vikings and the Irish and stuff. They've seen them on TV and stuff. And when I explain this to them, sometimes they click so well. Like, they understand that this is clans, these are, sometimes they have tribal attitudes, but they're mostly people who live in small villages. Someone strange comes in and then they're like, oh, they get all defensive, and then there's communication going on, and then they get on or they don't get on. It's very basic. Some people understand that. And then you've got some people, they don't click, and they see it that every village has a tricolour up, right? And we'll take it because I come across a lot of Irish people online right now who have a very nationalist view that every single village in Ireland in the early medieval period, they had a tricolour up. And then the Vikings, when they came running in, they have this big Norwegian flag or a Viking flag, or whatever a Viking flag would have looked like, and they wave it and they say, we're going to take over these lands in the name of Norway. And I'm reading these comments and I'm like, no, please stop. Yeah, that's basically what I wanted to cover for the time being. I could have easily gone way deeper in there. Of course, put all your comments down below. So far, I've absolutely loved all the comments that are coming in. I will also, in this video, if you stay longer as well, there's 3 main channels I want you guys to subscribe to. One of my friends, Alex, is also coming on the 1,000 mark. Butler is almost, we've had Butler and Alex on the channel a few times. He's almost hitting 1,000 as well. And there is a man making early medieval music, Norse-gaelic is his name of his channel. I post all the links below. He's also about to hit 1,000 subscribers. Very excited for it, very excited, because those lads have done so much grinding, they have done so much work. So it's great to hit that they're about to hit the 1,000 mark. So definitely go over to their channel, help them out. And also, as always guys, subscribe over to my channel. I'm mostly going to be focused on Irish medieval history. and medieval full stop, which is from 410 all the way to 1603. If you want me to cover any topic as well, please leave your comments below. Right now I'm not getting too much in right now, so I'll be able to get back to you no problem. I'm not getting bombarded like I was before the channel got taken down previously, so I will be able to reply to you ASAP unless I'm actually asleep, because I'm on Japanese time and not Western Europe time. Other than that, guys, thanks very much and all the best.